The snow fell in thick curtains across the frozen steppe, and beneath it, men huddled in trenches carved from earth that had already swallowed millions. It was December 1941, and the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of Moscow, closer than any invading army had come in centuries. The temperature had plunged to 30 degrees below zero. Soldiers on both sides were dying, not just from bullets and shells, but from the cold itself, from exhaustion, from the sheer psychological weight of industrial-scale killing that had no precedent in human history. In this crucible of suffering, the Soviet leadership made a decision that would become one of the most controversial and misunderstood policies of the entire war. They would give their soldiers vodka, 100 grams per day, every day, for years. This was not a celebration. This was not about Russian stereotypes or cultural clichés. This was a calculated response to a military crisis that threatened the very survival of the Soviet state. The Eastern Front was not like other theaters of World War II. It was a war of annihilation, explicitly designed as such by Adolf Hitler himself. The Nazi plan, called Generalplan Ost, envisioned the deliberate starvation of tens of millions of Soviet citizens and the enslavement of those who remained. German soldiers knew they were fighting a different kind of war here. Soviet soldiers knew that defeat meant not just military loss, but the extermination of their families, their villages, their entire civilization. The psychological pressure was unbearable. The human nervous system was never designed to withstand what these men experienced. Artillery barrages that lasted hours, turning forests into moonscapes. Katyusha rocket attacks that screamed through the air like demons. Panzer divisions smashing through defensive lines with mechanical precision. Entire regiments disappearing in a single afternoon. A soldier might wake up next to a friend and watch that friend die in an explosion before breakfast. He might see 100 men he knew reduced to corpses before sunset. And then he would be expected to do it again the next day, and the day after that, for months, for years. The Soviet military command understood that morale was as critical as ammunition. An army that breaks psychologically cannot fight, no matter how many tanks it has. And in 1941, the Red Army was breaking. The Germans had advanced hundreds of kilometers in weeks. Millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. Entire army groups had been encircled and destroyed. The initial period of the war was a catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale, and the men who survived it were traumatized beyond measure. Something had to be done to keep them functional, to keep them in the fight. On August 22, 1941, the State Committee of Defense issued Decree No. 562. It was brief and direct. Frontline soldiers, those in direct contact with the enemy, would receive 100 grams of 40% vodka every day. This was not a reward. This was a tool. The decree came just 2 months after the German invasion began, at the moment when Soviet losses were most catastrophic, and the need for any measure that could sustain combat effectiveness was most desperate. 3 days later, on August 25th, the People's Commissariat of Defense clarified the order. Pilots of the Red Army Air Forces would also receive vodka, as would the engineering staff serving field airfields. These were men under extraordinary stress, flying outdated aircraft against the Luftwaffe, watching their comrades shot down in flames, knowing that every mission might be their last. Tank crews, operating in the infernal heat and claustrophobic terror of armored combat, received double portions, 200 grams. Some pilots received cognac instead, a small concession to the idea that officers deserved something slightly more refined, though the purpose was identical. The policy was called the Narkomovskaya 100 gram, the People's Commissar's 100 grams. It became one of the defining features of life at the front, as routine as morning roll call, as expected as the daily ration of bread. But to understand why the Soviets did this, you have to understand what they were up against, both in terms of the enemy and in terms of the conditions. The Germans had their own solutions to the same problem. Wehrmacht soldiers received schnapps, distributed in similar fashion to boost morale and dull fear. But the Germans went further. They issued Pervitin tablets, a methamphetamine-based stimulant that flooded the central nervous system with artificial energy. Pervitin allowed soldiers to march for days without sleep, to fight without feeling hunger or exhaustion, to push beyond normal human limits. It was incredibly effective in the short term. It was also incredibly destructive. Soldiers became addicted. They suffered psychotic breaks. When the drug wore off, they collapsed. But in the early years of the war, when the Wehrmacht was smashing through Poland and France and the Soviet Union with terrifying speed, Pervitin was part of the formula. The Soviets chose a different path. Vodka was not a stimulant like Pervitin. It did not create artificial energy. What it did was provide rapid calories and dull the psychological edge of constant terror. Alcohol metabolizes quickly in the human body, especially high-proof spirits. 100 grams of 40% vodka contains roughly 224 kilocalories. For men burning thousands of calories a day in sub-zero temperatures, carrying heavy equipment, digging trenches, running across open ground under fire, those calories mattered. The alcohol also had a thermogenic effect, creating a sensation of warmth that, while partly illusory, provided real psychological comfort in conditions where frostbite could claim fingers and toes in hours. But the primary function was psychological. Vodka dulled fear. It made the unbearable slightly more bearable. It allowed men to sleep despite the nightmares. It gave them a moment of relief in a day otherwise defined by suffering. This was not about getting soldiers drunk. 100 grams is a small amount, roughly equivalent to 3.5 ounces, or a bit more than 3 standard shots. For most men, especially those eating poorly and under extreme stress, it was enough to take the edge off, but not enough to impair combat effectiveness. The goal was not intoxication. The goal was survival. The tradition of giving soldiers alcohol was not new. In the Russian Empire, as far back as the 18th century, soldiers received 3 glasses of bread wine per week during combat operations. This was standard practice across many armies. Alcohol was understood to have military utility. But in the early 20th century, attitudes began to change. After Russia's humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, military reformers blamed vodka for poor discipline and performance. In 1908, the practice was officially ended. Soldiers would no longer receive alcohol as part of their rations. 3 decades later, in 1938, the People's Commissariat of Defense issued a decree titled On Combating Drunkenness in the Red Army. The Soviet military, like Soviet society, was officially opposed to alcohol abuse. Soldiers caught drinking excessively could be dismissed from service or even prosecuted. The Red Army was supposed to be a modern, disciplined force, not a mob of drunkards. This was the official line. But then came the Winter War. In November 1939, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, expecting a quick victory. Instead, the Red Army encountered fierce resistance and brutal winter conditions. Soviet soldiers, many of them poorly equipped and poorly trained, were dying in the snow. Morale collapsed. Frostbite was rampant. In January 1940, Commissar of Defense Kliment Voroshilov proposed a solution. Soldiers and commanders would receive 100 grams of vodka and 50 grams of salo pork fat every day to help them stay warm. The policy was implemented. It helped. When the Winter War ended in March 1940, the vodka ration was discontinued. But the experience had been noted. When the Germans invaded on June 22, 1941, and the Red Army faced a crisis far worse than anything in Finland, the leadership remembered what had worked. By August, the vodka ration was back, and this time it would remain in place for most of the war. The implementation varied wildly depending on the unit, the commander, and the tactical situation. In some regiments, vodka was distributed before an attack, the idea being that it would steady nerves and make men more willing to charge into machine gun fire. In other units, it was given after a battle, a reward for surviving, a way to help men come down from the adrenaline and horror. In some places, it was handed out daily like clockwork. In others, it arrived irregularly, depending on supply lines and priorities. The front was chaos, and the vodka ration reflected that chaos. Private Alexander Grinko, who served in a rifle unit, recalled that vodka was given only before attacks. A foreman would walk along the trench with a mug, and soldiers could pour themselves a measure if they wanted. Grinko noticed a pattern. The young men, the new arrivals, drank eagerly. They were the ones who went over the top first, and they were the ones who died first. The veterans, the men who had survived multiple battles, were more cautious. They understood that vodka might dull fear, but it also dulled reflexes and judgment. They drank less, or not at all. Senior Lieutenant Fedor Ilchenko, who participated in the Battle of Stalingrad and was part of the group that captured Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus in February 1943, had a different perspective. For him, the vodka was essential not for courage but for warmth. Stalingrad. In the winter of 1942 to 1943 was one of the coldest battles in history. Soldiers fought in the ruins of a city, often without shelter, sleeping on frozen ground. Ilchenko said plainly that without the 100 grams, it would have been impossible to defeat the cold. The vodka, he believed, saved soldiers from frostbite and hypothermia when they had no other protection. Not everyone wanted it. Machine gunner Mikhail Larin remembered that in the early years he traded his vodka ration for sugar. Other soldiers would approach him like geese, he said, eager to take his share. For Larin, the sugar was more valuable. He was not interested in drinking. Guard Sergeant Georgy Veliaminov, who was young when he joined the army, said the same. The youth, he recalled, cared far more about food than about alcohol. 100 grams of vodka meant little when you were starving. A hot meal meant everything. The policy evolved as the war progressed. In May 1942, the rules changed. Vodka would no longer be distributed universally to all frontline troops. Instead, it would be given only to units that had distinguished themselves in combat, and their ration would be doubled to 200 grams. For everyone else, vodka would be reserved for holidays. This was partly a matter of supply. Producing and transporting millions of liters of vodka to the front was a logistical challenge, and the Soviet economy was stretched to breaking. But it was also a matter of incentive. By making vodka a reward for performance, the leadership hoped to encourage aggression and initiative. By November 1942, the policy shifted again. The standard 100-gram ration was restored for soldiers and officers directly engaged in combat. Those in reserve units or rear services received only 50 grams. This created a clear hierarchy. The men doing the hardest fighting, taking the greatest risks, received the full ration. Everyone else received less or nothing. It was a way of signaling who mattered most, who was bearing the heaviest burden. The policy was not uniform across the entire Red Army. In the Caucasus, where Soviet forces were defending against the German drive toward the oil fields of Baku in 1942, vodka was often replaced with local wines. The region produced wine, not vodka, and it made more sense logistically to use what was available. The effect was the same. Alcohol was alcohol. The goal was to keep men functioning under impossible conditions. By 1943, the tide of the war had turned. The Germans were defeated at Stalingrad, then at Kursk. The Red Army was advancing, pushing the Wehrmacht back across Ukraine, Belarus, Poland. The soldiers were no longer fighting in desperate defense of their homeland. They were now invaders themselves, driving toward Berlin. The psychological burden was different, but still immense. The killing continued. The dying continued. The vodka continued. When Victory Day came on May 9, 1945, the war in Europe was over. The 100 grams were officially cancelled. The Red Army no longer needed to sustain its soldiers with daily vodka rations, but the habit did not disappear. Many soldiers who had spent years drinking every day found it difficult to stop. Lev Kartashev, a veteran of the 83rd Guards Rifle Division, described returning to civilian life in Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg. He would go to the officers' mess hall for lunch and was shocked to see that officers still would not sit down to eat without 100 grams. And where there was 100, there was 200 and more. Kartashev watched and thought to himself that this would not end well. He was right. The Soviet Union would struggle with alcohol abuse for decades. The wartime policy of distributing vodka to soldiers had created a generation of men for whom daily drinking was normal, even necessary. This was not the only cause of Soviet alcoholism, but it was a contributing factor. The state had taught millions of men that vodka was a tool for coping with stress, and those men brought that lesson home with them. The question that remains is whether the policy worked. Did the 100 grams help the Red Army defeat the Nazis, or was it a costly mistake that created more problems than it solved? The answer is complex. There is no doubt that the vodka provided some immediate benefits. It gave soldiers calories they desperately needed. It helped them endure cold that would otherwise have been lethal. It dulled the psychological trauma of combat just enough to keep men functional. In the short term, in the context of total war, it was a rational decision. But there were costs. Some soldiers became dependent, some drank more than their ration, trading for extra or stealing from supplies. Some units suffered from discipline problems related to alcohol. There were cases of soldiers drinking before combat and making fatal mistakes. The policy was a gamble, and like all gambles, it had winners and losers. What is undeniable is that the Red Army did defeat the Nazis. It bore the overwhelming majority of the fighting on the Eastern Front. It suffered the overwhelming majority of the casualties. Roughly 27 million Soviet citizens died in the war, and the vast majority of those were in the western regions overrun by Germany. The soldiers who stopped the Wehrmacht at Moscow, who held Leningrad through 900 days of siege, who turned the tide at Stalingrad and Kursk, who marched all the way to Berlin, did so under conditions of unimaginable hardship. They were cold, hungry, exhausted, and terrified, and many of them had 100 grams of vodka in their canteen. It is impossible to isolate the effect of the vodka from all the other factors that determined the outcome of the war. Soviet industrial production, the vastness of Soviet territory, the brutality of Stalin's leadership, the courage and sacrifice of individual soldiers, the mistakes of the German High Command, the support of Lend-Lease aid from the Allies, all of these mattered. The vodka was one small piece of a much larger puzzle, but it was a piece that the Soviet leadership believed was necessary, and they continued the policy for years because they believed it worked. The legacy of the 100 grams is complicated. It is a reminder that war forces societies to make choices that would be unthinkable in peacetime. Giving soldiers alcohol every day would be considered reckless and irresponsible in any normal context. But the Eastern Front was not a normal context. It was hell, and the men who fought there needed every tool they could get to survive it. The vodka was one of those tools. Today, the image of the Soviet soldier with his 100 grams has become part of the mythology of the Great Patriotic War. It is romanticized in some quarters, mocked in others. But for the men who were there, it was neither romantic nor absurd. It was simply part of the reality of their lives, one more element of a war that consumed everything and everyone it touched. The Red Army defeated Nazi Germany, and in doing so, it changed the course of human history. The 100 grams of vodka, for better or worse, were part of that victory.